Hi, welcome to my channel. I am your Inner Light Coach, and I'm grateful you've joined me today. And today is Sunday Soul Sanctuary, so I was called to look at Acts chapter 24, so we're going to run through it. This video might be a little longer, but that's okay. There's so much static in the air today, my hair's not acting right, but we're going to get through this. So, Acts chapter 24, verse 1. This verse shows the urgency of Jewish authorities looking for ways to persecute Christians. Paul was a rising leader, and the authorities were threatened. Verse 2. Tertullus, the hired lawyer for the Jewish leaders, he pretty much starts by brown-nosing Felix, the judge, by praising the peace and reforms Felix has said to brought to Judea. And this is a common this is a common tactic of strategic flattery to win the judge's favor. Because, well, we'll see. Verse 3, Tertullus continues to work his flattery on Judge Felix, where actually Felix was known for his harshness, his unrest, and that made the flattery very insincere. So the idea was to paint Felix as good and Paul as bad in the court, so they could, so Tertullus could suck up to Felix and hopefully convict Paul. Verse 4. Tertullus appears considerate and disciplined by pretending to be respectful of Felix's time to keep Felix's attention. This was a setup before the accusations started flying. Verse 5. Tertullus accuses Paul of threatening public order, the order that Felix has supposedly upkept, and being the ringleader of a sect. Verse 6. Tertullus also added desecration of the temple, which was a very big deal according to the law of the time. In verse 7, this was a political maneuvering of blame. The Jewish leaders were acting violently toward Paul and Commander Lysias, sorry if I butcher names, who actually saved Paul's life when the Jewish leaders were attacking him. So Tertullus was trying to paint the Jewish leaders as lawful and Lysias as reckless. He wanted Felix to think that Lysias was disruptive, and the Jewish leaders were working in peaceful actions. And he did this to get Paul back in their control. So verse 8, Tertullus is trying to push Judge Felix's judgment of Paul because the Jewish leaders had no witnesses or proof of their accusations toward Paul. They were acting as their own witnesses. In verse 9, here we see a mob mentality. Tertullus is well-spoken and convincing, so much so that the Jewish community, although not witnesses, declared Tertullus's accusations to be truthful. This in hopes that a unified group would appear more credible to the judge, hoping that he would quickly convict Paul. In verse 10, this is the beginning of Paul's defense. Even after listening to the accusations against himself, when Paul speaks, he speaks with respect in a confident and composed manner. He steps up with calm truthfulness, with the trust in God's promise from Acts 23:11. In verse 11, Paul reminds Felix that he has only been in Jerusalem for 12 days. Surely not enough time to organize a riot, of which he was accused of. This was a verifiable public fact. Paul's facts or proof and motives falls Paul's facts were the proof, and his motives was worship, and he was able to address the evidence. Paul does this in a calm and rational way despite the hostility around him. Verse 12. Paul states that there is no proof, no witnesses, that he had that he had a dispute with anyone. He didn't stir up a crowd, and he didn't cause any trouble in the temple, the synagogues, or in the city. He proves that there were no witnesses, no evidence, and no incidences where he was in Jerusalem, and all through his speech he remained calm and respectful. In verse 13, Paul exposes the prosecutioner's total lack of evidence. Roman courts required witnesses, corroboration, and verifiable facts, and Paul's defense uses facts against Tertullus's flattery, logic against Tertullus's exaggeration, and transparency against Tertullus's political framing. Verse 14. Paul boldly declares that his faith in Jesus is not a rejection of Judaism, but the fulfillment of it. He admits to his faith, refuses to be ashamed, and still stands firm in his innocence, which models spiritual integrity. He insists that he is aligned with the God of Israel in the scriptures, not a cult. Verse 15. Paul declares that his hope in God includes the certainty of a future resurrection for everyone, the righteous and the unrighteous. This aligns Paul with mainstream Jewish belief, shows his teachings aren't new or illegal religion, and he brings to light how his accusers are objecting because he believes in fulfillment through Jesus. In verse 16, Paul discusses his behavior that come from his beliefs. Because he believes in the resurrection and the final accountability, he lives with a clean conscience. Paul lives in integrity, consistently, with no hidden motives, no secret grudges, no double life, and no spiritual compromise. He understands that people are affected by his actions, and God is the ultimate judge. Verse 17. This verse mirrors This is where Paul explains why he returns to Jerusalem after being away for years. He returned to financially help his people and present offerings to the temple. He didn't come back to cause trouble. He came back to worship and to show love to his own people. He was away planting churches and fulfilling his calling. He returned to put his compassion in action by uniting Jews and Gentiles. Verse 18. Paul continues his defense. He was participating in a purification ritual as an act of devotion and respect when the Asian Jews came upon him. He was alone and peaceful at the time of being accused. There was no crowd, no disturbance, no riot, and no chaos. He was quietly worshiping. The accusing Jews from Asia, who originally stirred up accusations, didn't even show up in court. All they proved was Paul's purity, peacefulness, obedience, and his alignment. Verse 19. Paul brings up the major point that the people who accused him hadn't shown up in court. If they really had a case, they would have showed up. In Roman times, no accusers equals no case. The Jewish leaders that did appear in the court weren't even in the temple but they were there to expose Paul. If he had actually done something wrong, the eyewitnesses would have been eager to testify. Their absence spoke volumes. Verse 19. This affirms... verse 20, sorry. Verse 20. Paul, still calm, leverages his power by putting the attention back onto the Jewish leaders and challenges them in front of Judge Felix. He simply asked them to state whether they actually witnessed him doing anything wrong. The Jewish leaders had nothing to say. Paul knows they can't speak up. And this was a smart legal move on his behalf. The prosecution couldn't name a crime. There were no witnesses. The case was collapsing. Paul doesn't need to defend himself with an emotion or fear. He invites the truth to speak, and the truth stands with him. Verse 21. This is the climax of Paul's defense. Before Judge Felix, Paul reveals the brilliant, real reason the Jewish leaders are angry with him. Their anger was based on theology and not legality. They opposed him because Paul's truth and resurrection challenged old systems, old power structure, and old interpretations. The growth threatened them. Verse 22. Judge Felix responds to what he has heard from both sides, taking into account political calculation and spiritual tension. Felix understands Christianity and knows it is not a violent movement or a political threat, and could see weak accusations. Felix delays the case when he could have dismissed it because he didn't want to anger the Jewish leaders, cause a riot by releasing Paul, but he couldn't condemn Paul without evidence, so the best he could do was delay. Delay was the safest political move that he could pull. He already knows Paul is innocent, although Lysias had already submitted a written report admissible to the court. Felix delays by calling for Lysias in person. Verse 23. Felix doesn't release Paul. Instead, he places Paul in lenient custody, somewhere between imprisonment and freedom. Felix knows Paul is innocent and keeps him under himself to protect him. Felix allows visitors, friends, support, provisions of food, clothing, money, and supplies, and communication. Felix made the decision of delay, but God uses the opportunity to keep Paul safe, give Paul time to minister, and position Paul for his eventual journey to Rome. This is divine orchestration. God's protection doesn't hesitate. Paul is not condemned, abandoned, silenced, or isolated. He is held in a space where he can rest, receive support, and continue his mission. Sometimes in the in-between seasons, where nothing seems to move, there's actually seasons of protection and preparation. Acts 24:23 is a reminder that delay is not denial. Sometimes it's God creating a safe container around you while the next chapter is being prepared. Verse 24. Felix brings his Jewish wife Drusilla to Paul to get her perspective. She understands Scripture, and Felix wants to hear what Paul has to say in Drusilla's interpretation of it. So the whole movement goes from a legal hearing to a spiritual conversation. Felix invites Paul to speak in his with his respect, curiosity, and a pull toward faith and truth. Felix isn't hostile. He's conflicted, drawn, and unsettled. Paul speaks about faith in Jesus Christ. Paul dives right into faith, salvation, Jesus, resurrection, accountability, and transformation. Felix is spiritually open. This divine setup positions Paul to speak truth to power. Felix and Drusilla hear the gospel straight from Paul's personal teaching. Acts 24:24 shows that God can turn a courtroom into a sanctuary and a political delay into a spiritual appointment. The revealed truth here is people who hesitate publicly may still be deeply moved privately. Sometimes the ones who seem undecided are actually wrestling with conviction. Verse 25. When Paul speaks about righteousness, Felix feels the weight of his history of corruption and cruelty. When Paul speaks about self-control, Felix and Drusilla are touched due to their scandalous beginnings, because Drusilla left her husband to marry Felix. They had to confront desire, impulse, power that was misused, and lack of discipline. When Paul speaks of God's judgment, Felix understands that in that conversation, he is not the judge, but the one being judged. He hastily tells Paul, "That's enough for now. You may leave. I'll call you when it's convenient." Paul spoke with clarity, and Felix's conscience kicked in. Felix's fear is evidence that Paul's words hit the exact place God intended. Verse 26. Felix keeps calling Paul back in hopes that Paul will pay Felix bribe money to release him. Felix is split between conviction of feeling the truth and the calculation of wanting Paul's bribe money. Paul, in his integrity, doesn't offer Felix a bribe. He trusts God, and he uses the opportunities to speak truth to Felix. God uses corrupt motives for his purposes. Felix's greed keeps bringing Paul to his room, which gives Paul opportunity to share the gospel with Felix and anyone listening. Felix's push for personal gain becomes a doorway for divine influence. Verse 27. Paul remained in custody for 2 years. Felix is about to be replaced. In order to stay on the good terms with the Jewish leaders, he sacrifices Paul's freedom for political convenience, which reveals his cowardice, his corruption, his people-pleasing, and fear of backlash. Porcius Festus, the new governor, will eventually send Paul to Rome, fulfilling God's promise. Paul's 2-year delay protects him from assassination, gives him time to strengthen beliefs, allows him to testify repeatedly to Roman officials, and positions him for his eventual journey to Rome. What looked like stagnation is actually divine positioning. Here's Fluffy. Sometimes God keeps you in a holding pattern, not because you've done anything wrong, but because the next chapter requires perfect timing. Paul is innocent, ready, faithful, and clear, yet he waits. Not because of failure, but because of purpose. God is aligning people, politics, leadership changes, travel routes, and future testimonies. Paul's delay is not punishment, it's preparation. Acts 24:27 affirms that the pauses have been protective. Waiting seasons are strategic, not wasted. So that was Acts 24, 1 through 27. And I was led there to work with that material, which I got a lot out of it myself. So thank you for listening. Let's get back to love. Fluffy. God is good. Love and light to all. Until next time, walk gently and shine brightly.